As you can see, today I'm going to be talking about trumpslation, a lovely neologism consisting of trump and translation, used sometimes to refer to how to translate his language from English into English. But I'm going to be using it today really to refer to the challenges faced by both interpreters and translators in conveying his ideas into other languages. And I've come up with the subtitle, The Role of Interpreters in Constructing the German Trump. And it's very much going to be about this kind of construction of Trump in the German media, looking at the role that interpreters play during that. Now, as you can see from the example on the first slide, this is a cover of Der Spiegel, and I'll be talking a little bit about that magazine. It's a weekly political magazine that's published in Germany. It's about 75 years old. It's been going for quite a while now, 76 this year, and is quite well known for its somewhat satirical and provocative front covers. So as you can see, we've got Trump there, America First, and the mutilated Statue of Liberty. So I'd like to move on to just briefly introduce myself to you, just so that you know where I come from. I do work in Germany, but I am not German, as you might notice from the accent. I come from Glasgow, Scotland. But I've been living in Germany for quite a while now. I'm a qualified conference interpreter. I'm a conference interpreter trainer. I'm a researcher in interpreting studies, a practicing conference interpreter. And I have a qualification, a PhD in interpreting studies, and I hold a professorship in Germany in the theory and practice of interpreting. So very much interested in how researching and theorizing about interpreting can impact on the teaching of interpreting and general awareness of the complexities involved in interpreting, and indeed the difficulties in dealing with challenges of political discourse. I think that's probably sums up what my concern is. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm working at the moment on the top project entitled, I'll give you the English gloss, it's Super Diversity, Migration, Power, Ethics, the Positioning of Interpreters in Politics, looking very much at issues around dealing with the subject of migration in particular, and the ethical dimensions of the use of interpreters in multilingual communication. So this is where this presentation really is embedded. A future project that I'm in the process of developing is one concentrating specifically on mediating populism, where I'm the ethics and the role of translation and interpreting in post-truth political discourse. So very much the kind of discourse that we're finding ourselves in at the moment, and how to navigate that in various ways. And the two things that are going to be part of that project is looking at how populist discourse is interpreted and translated in international organizations. And I'm looking specifically at the EU, the UN, and the Council of Europe. And then what I'm wanting to do is then to trace the role that translation and interpreting plays in the dissemination of populist discourses in the media, and I include social media in that. So just to give you an idea, project 1 is coming to a conclusion, and project 2 is kind of something that I'm very keen to be working on in the very near future, and indeed I'm kind of laying the foundations for as we proceed. So as you can kind of tell from those two projects, I'm very much interested in what happens to populist discourses when they are interpreted and translated, and indeed how the very act of interpretation and translation impacts on the reporting of these populist discourses in various monolingual media. So to give you an example, the one I'm going to be looking at today, I'm going to be looking at not only what happens in the translation or the interpretation process, but how is that then picked up, and how are these concepts, how do they travel, if you like, through journalism in the monolingual media. I'm going to be looking specifically today at how Donald Trump is constructed in the German media, and I'm going to be looking also at the role of interpreting in this construction. Now, I keep putting "and translation" in brackets because sometimes it's actually very difficult to establish when you're looking at reporting what exactly the source of the translation or interpretation is. You can look at how things are interpreted, and you can look at how things are translated, but at the end of the day, sometimes in the reporting, it's often very difficult to distinguish who's been the agent, if you like, in translating or interpreting that particular discourse. I'll give you some examples of that as we move on. So I'd like to kind of preface what I'm going to be talking about with a preamble. And I'd like to start by addressing why I define Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement as populist, and kind of looking at what type of populism their forces harness, what linguistic characteristics of his discourse are shared with other populists, and what characteristics of his discourse are idiosyncratic to him. And there's a few of those that we'll be looking at. It's been referred to in other publications as Trumpish. Yeah, I'm not too sure. We've got Trumpslation, we've got Trumpish, we've got Trumpisms, we've got all sorts of neologisms created as a result of the language produced by Trump. But we'll look at there's also quite a lot of characteristics that in his language that are characteristic of populist discourse as a whole. So it's not all idiosyncratic or idiolectic. So let's look at populist discourse then, and what constitutes populist discourse. Well, I think we're always kind of going through this at the moment, both in Europe and throughout the world, in the US as well, where we're seeing that the sort of status quo of consensus politics is beginning to, or has already ruptured, that we're seeing populist views entering mainstream media and multilingual institutions, and that there is a need for a research into this discourse and how it is interpreter mediated, because there's been quite a lot of discourse or a lot of work research on monolingual and comparative studies. Critical discourse analysis has looked at this. There's been special issues on the language of Trump and so on, but there's been very little done into the multilingual mediation of this type of discourse, this populist discourse. I think I saw that Magdalena is in the audience, and I'm delighted. I've been quoting her. She's one of the few people who have been working on racist discourse and other types of extremist discourse in the European context. There has been some work done. There's been some work done in China. Chonglong Gu has worked on this, for example, but there's definitely a need for more. So if we look at this kind of populist discourse and we set the scene for how we're going to approach it, then we also need to look at how we deal with what I term interpreter positioning. And my view on it is that despite the discourse and the kind of prescriptive approach towards interpreting and translating, there is no way that positioning can be avoided. It's inescapable. The interpreter in a situation where they are simultaneously interpreting cannot simply refuse to interact or react to stimuli. They have to say something. They have to react, or they don't actually have to react. They can also not react, but it's also an ideological stance. So what we're seeing here is when interpreters are confronted with this type of ideological discourse and populist discourse, that we have sites of ideological contestation where we're not looking, or I'm not wanting to really look at whether this is a good interpreter or a poor interpreter, or a good interpretation or a poor interpretation, but where we're looking at what is happening here and what indeed are the consequences of that decision that is made in that split second of simultaneous interpretation. It's not, however, a matter of complete observation and description. We're much more, or I certainly am much more interested in what are the ripple effects, the ideological ripple effects of this kind of positioning. So it's not necessarily only they made this choice, but it's, well, what was the consequence of that choice? So if we look at populism, I think you can probably say generally that in its new guise, it's been present in the collective consciousness since the 2016 presidential campaign. And we've seen that in Europe and beyond. I'm not going to list every one of those examples. I think we can all kind of, apply that to our understanding of political developments in these countries. And obviously it's not exhaustive. There have been other movements too. I think it's important here when we're talking about populism to not necessarily fall into the trap of assuming that populism is only right-wing. We have left-wing populism, or certainly there was a wave of it in Europe, anti-capitalist, anti-elite, anti-globalization. It is predominantly at the moment right-wing, where we have strong nationalist tendencies. We have attitudes towards immigration that previously were only found on the margins, and that's something that I'd like to pick up on today. Now, if we look at this kind of understanding of strong links to nationalism, we could, I think this is a rather nice cover there where we've got of The Economist, where we've got Donald Trump, Putin and Nigel Farage in the back. Marine Le Pen is also hiding in the very margins. As I say, the new nationalism has been defined as a kind of bitter populist rejection of the status quo that global elites have imposed on the international system since the Cold War ended, and which lower income voters have decided, understandably, is unfair. That was an article by Herschen Politico when he kind of picked up on this idea of very much the concentration towards your own country, no need for supranational organizations. We saw that in the Brexit movement in the UK. We saw that as well in the MAGA movement in the US. Okay, so as I said, America First and the UK pro-Brexit campaigns would be examples of this kind of new nationalism, an ethnic rather than civic nationalism, which certainly is looking towards reinforcing borders and turning inwards rather than looking out. So I think that kind of locates populism. There's another aspect to the political environment that we find ourselves in at the moment, and that is that of the post-factual or post-truth age, and it's affecting political discourse quite significantly. In that logos in the classical ancient rhetoric sense has gained or has lost quite a bit of weight. We tend, or certainly the trend seems to be to appeal to emotions rather than facts. That if utterances are repeated often enough, even if they're factually rebutted, it appears to be effective. And we seem to be moving towards devaluation of expert opinion. So the idea of pathos rather than logos, the idea of repetition being effective no matter whether there's a logical argumentation behind it, and indeed this devaluation of expert opinion. I've just brought two images along with me, one on the left for those of you who perhaps don't know the British context. This is the bus that was the Brexit bus, which was painted during the Brexit campaign to state that Britain sent the EU £350 million a week. It's since been proven that that statement was absolutely wrong. It was false. But despite that, this was a statement that was repeated and repeated and repeated through the Brexit campaign, and indeed was believed and many say was decisive in the decision of the population to leave the European Union. On the right-hand side, my right-hand side, you see Barack Obama's birth certificate, and I don't think I really need to say any more about that. I think we've all followed that that I was going to say scandal. It's not really a scandal. It was a very interesting kind of discursive construction of what it means to be American, and with people claiming to this day, despite the birth certificate being produced, that he is not American and therefore should not have been president. So this is a kind of interesting situation in which we find ourselves politically. And in that, obviously, language plays a significant role. In that, interpreter positioning also plays a significant role. And here we have interpreting positioning, which I define according to Davis and Haré as the discursive process whereby selves are located in conversations as observably and subjectively coherent participants in jointly produced storylines. And this is important. There can be interactive positioning in which what one person says positions another, and there can be reflexive positioning in which one positions oneself. And we see both kinds of interpreter positioning happening in multilingual mediated communication, where interpreters are referred to specifically. That would be interactive positioning when they position the interpreters, the speakers position the interpreters. An example of that would be in the European Parliament. For example, when someone would say something like, I'm not too sure I understood the interpretation, or if I understood the interpreter correctly. Okay, so that's positioning of the interpreter. And then we have reflexive positioning, in which one positions oneself, and that would be the self-positioning of the interpreter. And that's really what I think I'm probably more interested in terms of how the interpreter interacts within the discourse that they are interpreting. This is a pretty powerful image. Again, maybe here a small disclaimer from me. Some of the images and some of the opinions that I'm talking about today are not necessarily my own. This is this caused a huge scandal, this image in Germany at the time when it was released. Here you can see, for those of you who can't, I presume it's big enough. It's Donald Trump draped in a US-American flag with the what we call the Hitler Gruß, so the Hitler salute. And instead of Mein Kampf, the publication by Hitler, we have Sein Kampf, which Kampf just means fight or struggle. So this is highly intertextual, and it's highly controversial. And there was a huge debate, as I said, about it, about whether Stern magazine had gone too far with this particular image. So we're looking at how Trump is constructed in Germany, and in the German mainstream media in particular. I'm not talking about marginalized media or radical media at all. I'm looking specifically at the fairly mainstream media. I'll look at that with you later on, what exactly I'm looking at. So what we see in the reporting of Trump and the depiction of Trump is very much a tendency towards voyeuristic sensationalism. Now, I think I should probably clarify what exactly I mean by that, because I don't want there to be kind of false understandings of it. I'm using voyeuristic or voyeurism not in the sexual sense, yeah, so it's not a matter of someone having sexual gratification by viewing this. It's much more along the lines of that Lark Walsh uses it, which is in the sense of, that's a very good article, 2020, on true crime documentaries and the kind of fascination that they exert on their viewers. It's a kind of understanding of, it's kind of, I talk about it later on as well. It's kind of like being so fascinated watching a car crash that you can't react actively to influence it. I've got a definition of how I understand the term on the next slide, and I'll come to that. But just to make sure that we're on the same page, it's really this idea of anything that Trump says is blown up. Anything that he does is scandalized, and it's kind of very much in line with the kind of images that we're seeing here. We also have what I've referred to as manufactured outrage. I think you can see the parallels to Chomsky there with manufactured consent. And it's a curated image in the German media. This is also mirrored in lexical choice in reporting and in something that I'm going to be looking at with you today, which is the meta discourse of his language, about his language, and I'll come to that as we move on. So, voyeuristic sensationalism. I've defined it as the passive act of watching a sensational discourse unfold without being able or willing to take an active role to control or counter that discourse. So there's very much this kind of, can you believe he said that, approach to whatever Trump does and whatever he says. Okay. So if we come to an example of some of the reporting and some of the translation and interpreting that I'll be looking at with you today, here you can see two headlines. They're more or less the same, and that was to show that this headline kind of was across the mainstream media. We have from Spiegel Online and from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which are Spiegel Online's online version of the weekly news magazine that I'm going to be talking about later on. The Frankfurter Allgemeine is a conservative daily broadsheet that in Germany highly respected. And here we see two headlines saying, "Die Deutschen sind böse, sehr böse." This is meant to be a direct quote from Trump. What he said was one of his favorite terms, which is bad. Yeah, when he used to be active on what was then Twitter, he used to end and conclude some of his tweets with that, with an exclamation mark. Bad. That was obviously one of his favorite terms. Now, at that point, you had the choice to translate or interpret this as schlecht, which is the direct translation, okay? But what was opted for was the German term böse, which means evil, okay? So we already have this idea of amplification of something, where it's good versus evil, us versus them, and all of these kinds of dichotomies and oppositions that we'll come to later when we're looking at things like pronoun use. Okay, so quite interesting. And basically all media outlets chose this böse, this kind of, evil rather than bad. Yeah. So I'd like to come to some of the data that I'm going to be looking at today. As you can see, I've put the slogan, what are they called? Logos. I've put the logos of the various news outlets up there for you. I'm going to be looking mainly at ARD, ZDF, and Phoenix. On the left-hand side, those are three public broadcasters in Germany. Really, ARD is the first public channel, ZDF's the second one, and Phoenix is run by both of them and specializes more in current affairs. It's kind of the C-SPAN of Germany, I suppose, if you were to compare the two. Tagesschau I'm going to be looking at, which is the early or the evening news, the main evening news in Germany. It's also got a very, very strong and very long history since post-war. It's been in existence since 1950, more or less when post-war Germany was founded, and has a kind of a reputation for being quite staid and traditional. And that's why some of the things that are happening at the moment are quite surprising. Then we've got Der Spiegel, which I've talked about already, kind of known for being somewhat controversial. There's been a few political affairs and scandals that they have addressed and they have taken a stance on. And then we have the logo of Stern, which is another newspaper, kind of political affairs magazine that is published on a weekly basis. Okay, so that's, I'm going to be looking a little bit at the data. When I say data, I'm looking at both interpretations and reporting. So just to give you an idea, you probably can't read that, it's quite small, but I wanted to show you the graphic anyway. In terms of trustworthiness, these are figures from 2024, and Germans or people living in Germany were asked to vote as to which, whether they trusted these news outlets or not. And the Tagesschau, the evening news, has a score of 64%, so it's right up the top. And Der Spiegel's at 54%. Stern's a little bit less, 49%, but you see ZDF 62%. So really quite trusted news outlets as well. I think that's important. I'd like to come just briefly to Der Spiegel. These are three images that have been published in the past, well, since 2016, so since Trump really has been on the international scene. And they're quite strong images. The final one on the right-hand side with Trump as a emperor, yeah, that was very recent, and is kind of a reflection on his re-election. But these are strong images. And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on a little bit is the reporting of Der Spiegel of Trump, because the language of their reporting is not as strong as the images. And one of the things I wanted to look at was a report that was written by a political science, a German political scientist Perksen this last year, in which he kind of was asked to critique Der Spiegel's reporting of Trump, and came up with this kind of very interesting comment in that the visuals were far stronger than the criticism in the visuals was far stronger than the criticism in the text. Where we had attempts at demystification through written language, which was paired with simultaneous heroization and monumentization on the visual level. So almost this kind of myth of Trump, that you can see, a negative myth of Trump here, was kind of intensified by the visuals, but was simultaneously, there was an attempt at dismantling it in the in the text, in the analysis. And I thought that was quite interesting. Let's come to Trump's Lexis. This is one of his famous quotes in which he said, "I am very highly educated. I know words. I have the best words." So let's have a look at those words and the trends there. If we look at some work that's been done on Trump's rhetoric, particularly related to interpreting, we have people like Viennot, who's the French translator of Trump. I think it was purely written translation, but I'm not 100% sure. There may have been simultaneous interpreting too. In an article in 2017 stated, when he speaks, he seems not to know quite where he's going. There was observations of limited vocabulary, broken syntax and repetition of the same phrases. This has been underlined by work on the simultaneous interpretation of Trump's speeches into Arabic 2022. Now, we do need to distinguish between written speeches and spontaneous speeches, and something that I'm working on right at the moment, you see that very clearly where we have Trump's official inauguration speech, and then we have the ad hoc speech that he then held in front, so basically not with the official crowd, but with his supporters. And the differences between those rhetorically and ideologically and content-wise are very, very interesting. I'll come to that a little bit later on in the presentation. So with looking at spontaneous speech into Arabic, the challenges there were repetition of phrases that are sometimes somewhat incoherent. So I'll give examples of that a little bit later on. Then incoherence in general. For interpretation into Arabic, and I think generally for any language, challenging culturally specific items. Also the addition of abusive language, in this case, what you could categorize as racist language, and then unexpectedness. And I wanted to pick up on that a little bit, because one of the issues that we have when we're analyzing simultaneous interpretations is this issue of strategies. And to what extent are some of the changes, omissions, distortions, and so on that we encounter the result of cognitive challenges in processing. And as you know, I'm sure, anticipation is an incredibly important strategy for simultaneous interpreting. And one of the main challenges when interpreting Trump seems to be that it's very difficult sometimes to anticipate where he's going in terms of both his syntactic structure and his thematic progression. But I'll come again to that later on. So if I look at my analysis of Trump's language, we see all of the above, plus repeated idiosyncratic language use in the form of nicknames, monikers. He done, Rocket Man, Crooked Hillary, all of these kinds of things. He uses colloquialisms, which are often not of a register appropriate to where he is speaking. I look at a UN speech later on where we have quite a few colloquialisms that would not normally be produced in that setting. This is a kind of strategy of the populist, the appeal to the common man. We see that very much as well with Farage, who very much kind of sells himself as one of the people, and often the contradiction in there is not terribly clear to the audience, at least. Then there's also keywords around things like nation, nationalism, immigration, sovereignty. And we have something that was not mentioned in the previous slides, but the challenges of superlatives. So, you know, I have the best words ever, you know, all of these kinds of typical Trump utterances, particularly in reference to himself. What is new that I've added on is the reference to God. And I've just taken a short quote from the inauguration speech, which I'll not read to you, but he was saved by God to make America great again. Okay, so this is new and it's very prevalent in his inauguration speech. So I'd like to come to his inauguration speech and look a little bit at the original, the interpretation. So the top one is the original in English. The interpretation is the German part, and the English gloss is the gloss of the German, obviously. And I've done it fairly verbatim, so it's not terribly stylistically pleasant to read, but I think it's important you get the idea. Here in the original, you have things like, I'll send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country. That becomes ending it in English. It's in German. It's somewhat weakened, but nothing too major, I don't think. Just to give you an idea of this kind of written speeches that often are available in advance and are often quite reified in terms of the decisions that the interpreters make. But there is room for positioning. And here you can see this, where we have criminal aliens in the original English that's changed or interpreted into criminal strangers. Okay, very kind of odd expression in German. We would normally not talk about Fremden in that context, but certainly weakened in terms of its rhetorical force, in terms of its positioning as exclusionary character. So that's just an example of some interpretation that I'm in the process of analysing at the moment. What is also very interesting is meta-discourse, where we've got interviews by interpreters talking about the difficulties they have translating or interpreting Trump. Now, this is very unusual in a profession that's characterised by aspects and principles of neutrality, of confidentiality. We have a social media discourse going on under the hashtag of Trumpslation, where professionals are exchanging their personal opinion and their personal experience of interpreting Trump. This is being exchanged across languages, so it's not a purely German exchange. And we had a very public discussion in Germany following an interpreting faux pas, which happened at the inauguration in Phoenix, on the Phoenix channel in 2025. And I'd like to just play this to you. Now, bear with me. It's in German, obviously, but I think you might quite recognize what's happening. Okay, this is just an extract. This is the interpreter. This is the ad hoc kind of spontaneous speech that he started after the inauguration. And this is the interpreter interpreting. You can see the titles in English. Okay, so let me just
Trump-Fans, die haben gesagt, nein, jetzt ist die Zeit, die wahren Geschichten zu erzählen. Sag mal, wie lange wollt ihr bei dem Scheiß bleiben?
Okay, the second part, as he says, sag mal, wie lange wollen Sie bei dem Scheiß bleiben? He's live on air and he doesn't know he is. He thought he'd put his microphone off, and translated that means, can you tell me how long we're going to stay with this shit? Yeah, now it sounds a little bit more, Scheiß in German's not quite as hard, it's not quite as significant or offensive as shit in English, so I'm strengthening it a little bit. But it's still something that shouldn't have happened according to our rules of confidentiality and neutrality and professionalism. Now, this was really interesting because it made the headlines in Germany. And we had
Trump.
all of these headlines, you know, the Phoenix translator asks this with his mic open. He forgets that he's got his microphone on. And the poor interpreter ended up front page news, and also ended up front page or was given interviews in all of these publications, okay? Here he's speaking about his faux pas. He explains why he lost it during the Trump speech. And it was really, really interesting because the interpreter was sort of pushed into the limelight to justify his decision, or to excuse his decision, and to explain aspects of professionalism. And I found it very interesting, this kind of meta discourse that went around reporting of Trump. He'd also given an interview beforehand where he'd evaluated during the campaign, where he had interpreted for Trump at the television debates and had criticized Trump. So he was saying, you know, you feel a little bit dirty after interpreting. It's really unpleasant to have to say his words. Yeah. So all of these kinds of things were in an interview he'd already given. So he'd already kind of positioned himself before this faux pas happened. It's a really good teaching moment, this faux pas, to kind of think about what the role of interpreters really are. And so it kind of raises important issues around role, professionalism, ethics. What's the contribution of scholarly research to these discussions? Should we be describing rather than prescribing? Could we have a more nuanced definition of neutrality? Could we look at positioning rather than role? Now, this is something that's really interesting as well. It's quite recent as well. This is the Tagesschau. And usually what, this is, as I said, very traditional media. And usually what happens is that we either have an interpretation, or it's translated and reported on in the translated version. But here we have something else happening as a distancing strategy. Okay, so I'll just give you the journalist.
US-Präsident Trump hat sich in einem Interview verärgert über Kreml-Chef Putin gezeigt. Dem Sender NBC sagte Trump, er sei stinksauer gewesen, als Putin die Legitimität des ukrainischen Präsidenten Zelensky angezweifelt habe. NBC zitiert Trump wörtlich: "I was very angry and pissed off." Er habe Russland mit Zöllen gedroht,
Okay, now this again resulted in a scandal in Germany. First of all, the language that was used, and secondly, that the very respected journalist had spoken such bad English. But that's just by the by. But that he'd chosen, or that the decision was made to use the English quote as a distancing strategy. Again, kind of in the package of reporting and constructing Trump. Very interesting indeed. So, if I move on, I do have some more examples. I see my time is running out. Maybe this one example I can show you, where in the English, this is from the UN speech in 2017, where in the English we have going to hell, that parts of the world are in conflict and are going to hell. And then, oops, sorry, we have in the German, in einigen Ländern erlebt man wirklich die Hölle, which if we translate it, will give us one really experiences hell. And that's quite a different thing. That's a far more sympathetic interpretation than what we have in the original, okay? So these kinds of shifts are happening. In interpretation, there's also examples of strengthening on behalf of the interpreter, strengthening utterances. Very interesting and data that I'm still dealing with in quite a lot of detail. I'm going to skip this. This was just issues around nationalism. Just to conclude, perhaps, with some tentative conclusions, I think populist discourse poses different challenges ideologically for interpreters. It's not uniform the way that they react. It's not monolithic, often intuitive and hybrid. Overtly populist discourse may encourage more ideological rigidity, but spontaneous speech is distinctively less coherent and more coded and poses other challenges. Despite this, nuances and contradictions of positioning could be observed. I think it remains an interesting avenue for research. I hope so. It's certainly something that fascinates me. And a kind of work in progress that I'm talking about today is this kind of meta discourse on both interpreting Trump in English and into other languages, reflecting as interpreters and translators on role, identity, and power. I think I'm going to leave it there, otherwise we're not going to have any time for questions. Should I open the floor, or is someone going to do that for me?